At the beginning of the year, both major parties of New Zealand politics descended on the Art Deco capital of the world, the city of Napier, New Zealand, for their annual caucus retreats, a little team-building exercise before heading back to Wellington to start a new year, and an election year at that. But while at the Labour Party retreat, Jacinda Ardern had an announcement to make. And one as shocking as the earthquake that resulted in all those Art Deco buildings, at least to anyone who wasn't paying attention to Labour's dwindling polling numbers. That announcement was her resignation as New Zealand's Prime Minister. So indeed, Labour had some team building to do. And there was only one man for the job. Chris Hipkins had earned a reputation of being a problem solver as COVID-19 response minister in the face of the pandemic, and then as police minister during a spate of ram raids. And his centre-left party had one more problem for him to fix: their dwindling polling. One quick aside. I'm not going to explain New Zealand's mixed member proportional electoral system in any detail in this video. I've done that before in previous videos, links below. But just to remind you, when Kiwis vote, they tick two boxes. One for a local representative, just like in a first-past-the-post system, and another for a party. It's the party vote that is what determines the proportion of seats each party gets in Parliament, and thus, who wins overall, and for the most part, it's what we will care about throughout this video. No sooner had Hipkins been sworn in as Prime Minister at Government House, he was presented with a crisis to deal with. A tropical atmospheric river moved over the north of the country and brought with it thunderstorms and rain, lots of rain. Over Auckland anniversary weekend, severe flash flooding occurred across the city, claiming the lives of 4 and warranting a state of regional emergency to be declared. Grant Robertson, the finance minister, stated that it was the country's costliest non-earthquake disaster ever, but that record didn't last long. Cyclone Gabrielle arrived on the scene 2 weeks later, bringing with it even more rain. Hipkins found himself thrust into the limelight of the Beehive bunker, facing the nation as the disaster unfolded. Just as COVID had put Jacinda Ardern in centre frame, he was enjoying a dose of free publicity. The flooding caused by Cyclone Gabrielle, the Auckland anniversary weekend floods, and Cyclone Hale, which had caused flooding in Gisborne and Coromandel just before Hipkins took the top office, thrust climate change into the spotlight. And for the Greens and Labour, with their strong climate change agendas, polling started to look a little bit better, at least for a while. But the reality is, though the public are aware that climate change is a major issue that needs to be addressed, they are not, on average, well informed on how to do that. One of the biggest climate change policies is the emissions trading scheme, and most people don't understand how that works. This year, therefore, politicians could afford to provide lip service towards climate change without really having the public be too rigorous with their scrutiny. The cost of living crisis, on the other hand, all but the richest Kiwis were, and still are, all too aware of. And this would be the biggest issue of the 2023 election. Hipkins represented a shift towards the centre for Labour, and he soon embarked on lighting a policy bonfire. A much criticised plan to merge New Zealand's public television and radio broadcasters was first onto the bonfire. Immediately following that onto the fire was a new insurance scheme to help laid-off workers, then a mandate for fuel suppliers to increase their use of biofuels, legislation to outlaw hate speech against religious groups, a scheme to help households scrap their old cars, and planned speed limit reductions were reduced to only the most dangerous roads. And also onto the fire, another scheme to lease clean cars to low-income families, alcohol reforms on pricing, sponsorships and advertising, a scheme to provide small refunds for consumers returning containers, lowering the voting age to 16, and work on Auckland Light Rail and other transport projects was to be rolled out in stages. It was quite the inferno. This was all in an effort to slim down government spending and, as Hipkins put it, focus the government's time on the bread and butter issues facing New Zealanders. And, of course, if all were to go to plan, turn Labour into a lean, mean election-winning machine. Many expected the controversial Three Waters policy to be put on the bonfire too, but while the name found itself officially going up in flames, the policy was reworked as the Water Services Reform Programme. These reforms aim to centralise the management of stormwater, drinking water and wastewater, the aforementioned Three Waters. Control would shift from the 67 local councils to several new publicly owned regional entities. Few would seriously argue that water reforms are not needed. Storms in Auckland, for example, have regularly led to beach closures due to sewage overflows. But local councils are opposed to a reduction in their power and a loss of income through water rates that they might have even been spending part of on water management. Part of this reduction in power is the inclusion of a co-governance provision in the reforms. This would see the councils sharing power with Māori within the new entities. For Māori, this simply represents the Crown living up to its side of the deal made in the Treaty of Waitangi, New Zealand's founding document. But for opponents, this represents an undemocratic power play. So Māori issues could potentially be key to this election. In the middle of the year, Te Pāti Māori were polling to be Kingmaker, holding the balance of power and able to choose which major party could form a government. But ultimately, they are a left-leaning party. Te Pāti Māori almost didn't survive coalition with National. Their most probable move would be to back Labour. But that doesn't mean they're always playing nice. Well, Hipkins was on the other side of the world watching New Zealand's new head of state have his coronation. Customs Minister Mika Wariti decided she'd had enough of Hipkins' march towards the centre voter and left the Labour Party to join Te Pāti Māori. Her resignation, though, wasn't the only team-building issue in Cabinet. Hipkins' Policy Bonfire soon became his Minister Bonfire. In March, Stuart Nash was sacked for emailing confidential documents to donors, breaching rules set out in the Cabinet Manual, part of New Zealand's unwritten constitution. In June, Michael Wood was stripped of his portfolios due to his failure to declare financial interests that were in conflict with his ministerial responsibilities. And in July, a drunk Minister of Justice, Kiri Allen, was arrested for careless driving. She resigned from her portfolios the following morning, admitting she was still struggling with mental health issues. Quite rightly, no serious contenders really wanted to critique mental health issues too strongly, so after just a couple of pointed comments about the state of Cabinet, the opposition soon changed the subject. Nicola Willis had an announcement to make. Labour's tax policy, removing the goods and services tax from fruit and vegetables. She, of course, thought this was a terrible idea, arguing that supermarkets would simply keep the savings for themselves, and Labour wasn't even united in support of the proposal, with Willis claiming that Finance Minister Grant Robinson had raised serious concerns about it, and that Revenue Minister David Parker had resigned over it. That was half true. With the reshuffle caused by Allen's arrest, Parker had requested the revenue portfolio to be given to someone else, but by his telling, this had more to do with Hipkins ruling out a wealth tax than GST. But these leaks and resignations gave Labour the feeling of a tired government heading towards an election loss. With the parliamentary party collapsing around him, Hipkins got some less than desirable polling results. But it also had the feeling of not really being his fault. He had handled these issues as well as anyone could be expected to. And while his party suffered, his preferred Prime Minister polling stayed ahead of his rival, at least for a while. That rival is Christopher Luxon. He has been leader of the centre-right National Party and thus leader of the opposition since November of 2021, despite being only a first-term MP. Before his political career, he had worked for Unilever in New Zealand, becoming CEO of the latter, and he's widely seen as the designated successor to former Prime Minister John Key. For the majority of the year, he was content to focus on uniting his own party after several years of infighting, while letting Labour implode all by itself. As they say, oppositions don't win elections, governments lose them. Up until Parliament closed for the official campaign period, Luxon was behind in preferred PM polling, but the government was heavily underwater in the government approval rating polls, and New Zealanders don't vote for a Prime Minister. At least not officially. We still have leaders' debates after all. But then, with Parliament closing, the official campaign period began, and political junkies got to set their teeth into the actual policy announcements, with Luxon and everyone else hitting the campaign trail. By far the biggest issue on the table was the cost of living crisis. This is a global issue with high inflation around the world, but despite that, governments are expected to manage the economy, and this would be a cost of living election. and of course the political parties all have different ideas on how to tackle that issue. Labour indeed pledged to remove GST from fruit and vegetables to help people with their daily costs, as well as pledging to provide free dental care to everyone under 30 as their other headline policy. A somewhat underwhelming proposal given that the Greens had already pledged to provide free dental to all, but the Greens were also pitching a wealth tax, ruled out by Labour, to fund their more extensive spending. So that was as much as Labour could afford to offer. The right-wing parties, National and ACT, wouldn't dream of cutting GST on anything. While for those on the left, GST is a regressive tax that punishes the poor who spend more of their income on essentials, for those on the right, it's a good tax that raises revenue without disincentivizing economic productivity. But the right wing does like to cut taxes, and National's tax plan centered around cuts to income taxes. National would pay for these by redirecting revenue from the emissions trading scheme that people don't really understand, so no political harm there. Cuts to public services and benefits by indexing benefit increases to inflation rather than wages, and a set of new taxes, including a foreign buyer's tax on the purchase of houses, though it's questionable whether that is even possible, as approximately half of New Zealand's tax treaties contain non-discrimination clauses that forbids taxation discrimination on the grounds of nationality for citizens of nations with these agreements. Perhaps National are signing New Zealand up for an international dispute with this idea. Regardless, National promised that they did have their numbers independently checked, but for some reason they decided not to release their maths. But never mind. Economists from across the political spectrum ran the numbers and found an enormous hole. National is a party with traditional values, and perhaps it's now a tradition that fiscal plans presented in election campaigns can have one or two gigantic fiscal holes in them. So nothing new here. But Hipkins didn't really want to talk about his own policies anyway. He was on the attack, running a negative campaign reminiscent of Judith Collins' style 3 years ago, since that worked out so well. And after a lackluster first leaders debate on national television, he came to the second all guns blazing, with National's dubious tax policies being his biggest target. He was widely declared the winner of that second debate, but would it be enough to turn around Labour's dismal polling numbers? Also in those debates, Luxon was pushed on the Winston Peters problem. New Zealand First was booted out of Parliament at the last election, but they have been there before, having lost all their seats in 2008, only to return 3 years later. And now, New Zealand First was polling increasingly close to the 5% threshold of the party vote needed to re-enter Parliament. Winston had clawed his way back up by tapping into populist anti-establishment discontent, those angry at the COVID vaccine mandates, and those afraid of what would happen in women's toilets if trans people get to exist. These may be imported non-problems to me, but they were adding up for the comeback king. Winston had ruled out working with Labour, and Hipkins had ruled out working with New Zealand First in return. National's preferred partner, David Seymour, had ruled out working with New Zealand First too, so the nation wanted to know if Luxon was ruling them in or out. His answer was reluctantly in, and that was enough of an endorsement to push New Zealand First comfortably over the threshold in the following polls. The comeback king was set to return once again. The prospect of having to deal with a three-headed coalition and having to manage both Seymour and Peters around the cabinet table sent National into panic mode. It looked like it could be a coalition of chaos, the exact attack line they had levelled at the prospect of a Labour-Green Māori coalition. It scared them so much, National's campaign chairman Chris Bishop warned of a possible hung parliament and a second election if Winston were to hold the balance of power. Though if you want an unstable government, Seymour's suggestion of offering National only confidence, but not supply, would probably produce the most unstable government in New Zealand's history, with every single spending decision needing individual approval from the minor party. In the dying weeks and days of the campaign, National seemed to be hitting a snag, and when Hipkins came down with COVID, forcing the press leaders debate to be rescheduled, Luxon took the opportunity to avoid the debate entirely. He was doing far better when talking with tightly controlled supporters on the campaign trail than he was when put under the spotlight by Hipkins on the national stage. It felt like momentum was building for Labour, and the left had a glimmer of hope for a at least less awful result 2 weeks out from election day. An ACT's vote too had dropped in the polls, even losing the support of their party's co-founder Sir Roger Douglas, who said the party now represents only the wealthy. And with New Zealand First becoming a viable alternative, along with revelations that some of their candidates had liked or even posted some less than socially acceptable viewpoints on social media, leading to a string of candidate withdrawals, they definitely weren't trending in the right direction. Just days out from the election, ACT would lose one more candidate, their Port Waikato candidate, Neil Christensen, who tragically died just days out from the election. Port Waikato is a safe national seat, so I doubt he would have actually won. But the rules are the rules, and a by-election needed to be called without delay. What's more, because the rules are the rules, this would elect an extra seat to Parliament, meaning the next Parliament would have at least 121 members, instead of the usual 120. I say at least because under New Zealand's MMP system, overhang seats are created if a party wins more electorate seats than it deserves based on the party vote, so that number could increase. But as the votes came in on election night, it became apparent the red wave from last time had been followed by a blue one. Any glimmer of hope Labour had of building momentum quickly evaporated. It's been a tough few years, with a pandemic and an economic recession to deal with, and perhaps paralleling the recent productivity of your favourite educational creator, perhaps Labour hasn't been as productive with their majority the last few years as their supporters would have liked them to be. The mood for change was strong. For National supporters though, it was a night of celebration. With half the vote counted, the right-wing parties had a commanding lead, with National and ACT looking to be set to govern without the need for Winston Peters and New Zealand First. But as more of the vote was counted, that commanding lead dwindled a little bit. At the end of the night, the results stood with National holding 50 seats and their preferred partner ACT adding 11, a combined 61 seats, and enough, just barely, to govern without the help of New Zealand First in the 121-seat House, with one overhang seat generated by Te Pāti Māori landing 4 electorates. But realistically, a one-seat majority wouldn't be the strong, stable government that Luxon had promised. He was certain to pick up the phone to call Winston Peters, who had returned to Parliament once again with 8 seats going to New Zealand First. A one-seat majority would leave the government vulnerable to any backbencher who wanted to take a stand on some issue, and I'm sure National doesn't want a retake of 1984. But the election night results are only the preliminary results. About a fifth of the votes are special votes, cast by people like me who live overseas or are, for whatever reason, out of their electorate on election day. And for the final results, we had to hurry up and wait for these to be carefully counted by the Electoral Commission. The specials tend to swing a little bit left, but that doesn't mean they have to. It was possible that the expat Kiwis were angry at being locked out of the country during COVID and would turn towards National, just like the rest of the nation. But spoiler, no, they didn't turn towards National. The specials swung left and National lost 2 seats, down to 48, and also the National ACT majority in the process. But Labour didn't pick them up. The Greens got one of them, bringing their total to 15. The other went to Te Pāti Māori, effectively removing their overhang seat. However, they also won 2 additional electorate races, with the special votes added, giving them 6 out of the 7 Māori seats, and giving Parliament 2 overhang seats. And of course, the Port Waikato by-election will also generate an overhang seat, so the total seats in the House will now be 123. Luxon will need 62 seats to form a majority, and his 48 and ACT's 11 don't get him to that number. He now needs New Zealand First, not just as an insurance policy against disloyalty from his own backbench, but to actually form a majority in the first place. Winston is back as the Kingmaker, and reportedly the Kingmaker hasn't been picking up the phone to David Seymour, so the cabinet table might be interesting. That's not all that surprising. He negotiated with Labour alone in 2017, keeping the Greens out of cabinet, with Labour negotiating a separate confidence and supply agreement to make up the numbers. And of course, David Seymour wasn't always respectful on the campaign trail either. But still, coalition negotiations between the 3 parties would soon be in full swing, so now groups of aides and leaders would cut a deal to get Luxon his majority. Luxon initially projected confidence that, considering his merger and acquisition experience from the private sector, a deal would soon be signed, and he would love to jet set off to San Francisco for the APEC summit on November 16th and 17th as the nation's new Prime Minister. Winston Peters, on the other hand, is not a negotiating partner to be so easily dismissed. When Luxon and Seymour headed to Wellington, expecting the first face-to-face meeting between the three leaders, Peters decided to make a point and remain in Auckland. It was a humiliating lesson for Luxon to learn, but if he needed Winston's support, and he did, he would need to treat him with the respect a former Deputy Prime Minister and someone with 44 years of political experience deserves. So with humble pie eaten and lesson learned, Luxon dropped the ambition to attend APEC, and behind closed doors, the three teams got back to the negotiating table. Well, the rest of us idly speculated who would become the Deputy Prime Minister. Then, after weeks of negotiations, the leaders emerged to their respective podiums to announce a historic coalition deal. The fight for who would be Deputy Prime Minister had been won by Winston Peters, as well as David Seymour. The two would split the role, with Peters holding the office for the first half of the term and Seymour replacing him in the second half. That is, assuming it doesn't all fall apart before then. It was a historic deal with the split Deputy Prime Minister, but also historic as the first time three parties have all entered coalition together in New Zealand, all three providing cabinet ministers. For example, Nicola Willis got the Minister of Finance portfolio, Peters is reprising the role of Minister of Foreign Affairs, while ex-deputy leader Brooke van Velder got the equivalent domestic role of Minister of Internal Affairs. As with any coalition, there was compromise. For example, National's tax plan will go ahead as presented in their manifesto, except for the foreign buyers tax. New Zealand First insisted on being scrapped. But given the criticism the plan had attracted, National might be quietly relieved. But its absence does leave a bit of a hole in the budget. The money will apparently be found through reprioritisation and other revenue gathering. And time is ticking to come up with that cash, because on the campaign trail, Nicola Willis said as Finance Minister she will release a mini-budget by Christmas. But if her version of trickle-down economics is going to make for a better mini-budget than the version presented in Liz Truss's mini-budget last year over in the United Kingdom, she will need to avoid funding it with borrowing, and with something a little more concrete than reprioritisation and other revenue gathering. The new Finance Minister might have a plan though. Within the coalition agreements, it was revealed that the new government will repeal the groundbreaking anti-smoking legislation passed by the previous government. Legislation that would have effectively banned smoking in New Zealand, and also effectively banned the smoking-related deaths too, as well as banning the tax income generated from cigarette sales. But Willis said the quiet part out loud, and admitted that repealing this will help pay for her tax cuts. That slip indicates a level of callousness I can personally hardly understand. Either that or it indicates Luxon's inexperience caught up with him when negotiating with Winston Peters and David Seymour. But those negotiations happened behind closed doors, so we will never really know. But after a weekend off, ministers were sworn in at Government House, and New Zealand has itself a new government with a new direction. And that government has already been described as probably the most right-wing government since the 90s. So now I'll ask you, what do you make of New Zealand's new direction? And also, what do you think was a glaring omission in this story? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, thanks to the help of great people like you on Patreon for making this video possible. To Richard Jones for the theme tune, and to everyone who supports the channel.